excited for today's guest, who I'm going to introduce here in a second. But before we get going here, just a couple of logistical things. If you're watching this on LinkedIn or YouTube or Twitter, we're going to be watching the streams here, or the chats in each of those platforms. So if you see me looking around while we're talking, looking around on my screen, it's because I'm looking for questions, and I'll be posing some of those questions here to our guest and for us to discuss. So feel free to pop those questions that you might have as we get going here. Pop those into the chat as they come up, and we'll be happy to get to those. And if you're watching on Crowdcast as well, which is where we're broadcasting from, certainly ask any questions you have here where we are here today. So I'm excited for today's guest. It's Mike Bestvina from Renna Partners. And Renna Partners is a consulting company that helps organizations, or helps their clients, make informed decisions about IT spend. And in particular, one of the things they're known for, and sort of the area that we've worked with them on the most, is on supporting technology strategy and M&A types of situations. So the reason I wanted to have Mike on the show here today, and I'm going to ask him to introduce himself and Renna in a little bit more detail and do a better job than I just did describing what Renna does. But the reason I wanted to have Mike on the show today is because, one of the things that we see in the market that's challenging is to build an IT competency that is able to scale for growth. And that goes, that comes down to the infrastructure, the people, the applications. There's a lot of different pieces of IT strategy that goes into any sort of high growth environment. And a lot of times companies are constrained by their lack of maturity or their lack of capabilities in the IT space, or in certain aspects of the IT space. So that's really the whole context of what we want to talk about today, is talking about building an IT competency that allows organizations to grow, to be more scalable, to achieve whatever goals and objectives they have for the future. So that being said, I want to introduce to Mike. Mike, welcome to our live stream.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So before we get started here and sort of fire away with some starting point questions that I have, and then certainly we'll open it up to audience questions as well as we're going here. And by the way, for those of you listening live, please feel free to chat at any time. Just pop in a question and we'll get to those. But maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then a little bit about Renna, if you don't mind.
Sure. So nice to meet you, everybody. It's Mike Bestvina. I started my career actually at SAP. I've actually worked in the ERP space for quite a bit, and actually maintain a lot of my background has been on sort of software providers in enterprise software. So actually sitting on the sort of software provider side, but kind of balance between that with actual implementation of going into companies and putting ERP systems in. So for about the last 6 years, I've been working almost exclusively in M&A with sort of technology lens around that. Renna Partners was started about 3 years ago. A former business partner of mine, him and I started this off, and actually with another partner of ours, and we've grown quite a bit in the last couple of years. As you mentioned, our focus has been technology strategy. So we're a boutique firm that works almost exclusively, I would say, in middle market private equity. So call it middle market and lower middle market. So to your point around sort of IT strategy, a lot of what we see is acquisitions being done in that space. And that can go from everything from kind of your classic manufacturing, distribution, healthcare, business services companies, retail, through to technology-enabled businesses. So business services, for example, that might have built their own proprietary technology, all the way through to what is kind of, I would say, called technology-led or software companies, as they're probably more widely known. And so what we do is we do a lot of due diligence in terms of helping clients support those transactions on the buy side, do a little bit of sell side, and then a lot of sort of, as you can imagine, in today's environment, there's a lot of carve-outs and sort of interesting mergers happening. So we help our clients kind of navigate how technology should be used, how much they should be spending on technology throughout those sort of complexities. And to your point, when we think about growth, in our space, growth has a lot to do with acquisitions. and also complexities around that. And so what we're helping sort of clients do and understand is how do you navigate those things? How do you navigate them in a meaningful way? And they can be very complex and difficult. And I think I've got my fair share of war stories, as I'm sure you have, about what can go wrong if you don't do it the right way.
Yeah, and it's a totally different mindset too when you think about growth and scaling. And certainly, if you're a large organization going out to acquire other companies, I mean, it's just a different level of maturity and capability you need to get there. And certainly want to get to that here in a second. So great. It's good to have you on the show, and I'm excited to dive into some of these topics with you in a little bit more detail. As we're getting started here, one last request for the audience that's listening live. If you don't mind, just pop in the chat box where you're joining us from. What part of the world are you in? What city are you in? Typically, we have a pretty global audience, so it's always interesting to see what regions of the world that everyone is joining us here today. And I'll circle back to that here in a second and let Mike know where all these people are joining from that we've got here on the line here. So I guess just to start, Mike, while we're waiting to hear where people are joining from, what are some of if we sort of just set the context here of growth and scale and how IT and the technology function within an organization can support that scale, or in some cases, as you mentioned, it might undermine that ability to scale. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see that IT departments have when they're scaling for growth, whether it's M&A related growth or even organic growth? I imagine there's some differences, but there's also probably quite a few similarities as well.
Sure. So, in a lot of cases, the first person that's asking us about those questions are typically sort of our financial sponsors, who are usually private equity firms. And I think it's important, just context one from our experience, but then how that sort of translate down into the companies themselves and the portfolio companies or a company that's potentially being acquired. There's sort of the big question is, can the system scale, right? And I think what we often have to do is sort of parse what that actually means. I think when the technologist in me says, can the thing scale? I think we'll just throw more hardware at it, right? And I think the reality is actually it's obviously a lot more nuanced than that. And I think that's really the important part, I think, to get right before even talking about like what are the challenges. And so, because the challenges become very obvious when you start to think about what does scale actually mean. One big thing I think that we often find are like historic legacy systems, and I would say more categorically known as, call it, technical debt, is always a serious concern to scale. That's a pretty obvious one, just because it's when you see it, that it can present a situation. And I think to get more sort of technical on those things is what we'll often find is that there's paradigms that may have been used 30 years ago that no longer are needed or no longer have advantages to them. And so because the environment has changed, then therefore the scaling becomes the challenge. I think one of the biggest areas there, and has been talked about for 60 years probably, is integration. The ability to integrate into other systems or have other systems integrate back into your systems becomes incredibly important, because what ends up happening is you want to have that flexibility and agility. And if you talk to any of these companies, you talk to the business people and then you talk to the IT people, there's always incongruence between the two, because the IT people want to have control and they want to have sort of steady rates of how things get adopted. And the business just wants to get the business done in the most efficient way possible without, discerning between business processes and whatnot. So integration becomes a huge point of contention, but also a huge point of how do you scale the system. Another thing that we see often, especially in acquisitions, is we're starting to see more and more companies acquire more tangential businesses, meaning not just consolidation of industries, but actual going into other markets. So a very classic example is you have sort of the wholesaler, distributor, retailer function that's in some cases being completely vertically integrated now. And in that case, you now look at IT and you might have a distribution system that's set up in a way for a distributor. And now they want to sell online, for example, and become much more like a retailer and get more margin. all of a sudden now they can't get their inventory, values out. And in fact, we've seen this. It's in some ways, I would say crazy, but I'm sure there's some audience members that can relate to this, is, having to manually take e-commerce orders and then punch them into an ERP system. And so all of a sudden now the system that didn't even know what e-commerce was because they implemented it 20 years. And even if they upgraded the system, it may even have that sort of integration point, but it doesn't have that built in. All of a sudden now has to adapt to the changing environment. So I think those are some really common things that we see, that it's not even just a, hey, can the system technically take more load? It's actually the environment changed, and now we need to adapt to that environment, and our system can't adapt to that environment.
Yeah. Yeah. You probably remember the days too. I think we started our careers around the same time, but you probably remember the days where scalability meant, can we handle the transaction volume? And you would actually evaluate that, as part of our ERP evaluations way back when. You'd say, hey, can this system handle, 10,000 sales orders a month or whatever the number is? And now that's not really as much of an issue as what you're talking about, which is more the general capabilities and, are those capabilities keeping up with the changing aspect of your business?
Right.
And along those lines, are you seeing with some of this M&A work you're doing and some of these, you guys are seeing pretty dramatic or extreme growth situations, because there's an injection of capital of some sort, or an acquisition, or in some cases a carve out, or, there's just a lot of change or turmoil, for better or for worse, in those situations. But are you seeing that that's been accelerated with just the current environment that we're in? I know you and I were talking before we went live here a little bit about how, the market's going crazy on the M&A side, and there's just a lot of acquisitions happening. But tell us maybe a little bit about what you're seeing there in the market in general.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are two factors. One, desire to grow, which is always a factor. But I think that there's being pressure because you have, if you look at public markets, right? Because everything kind of derives from public markets, right? And so where is all the growth happening? And I'm saying this from a sort of non-COVID perspective, right? Well, this trend was happening anyway, even before COVID, where software companies were becoming kind of much more commonplace because they were actually producing financials, and then going public, and people were realizing that these companies are actually really printing cash. And so now you had this whole sector of people that were chasing those deals, and now they're saying to the sort of more traditional, let's call it the GEs and the Walmarts of the world, saying, hey, you guys got to go compete with these guys, because if I'm going to put my dollar into a company today, an investment, I want it to double instead of just going at 8 to 10% a year. And even if that is the case, everything is being more attracted towards those investments. So what's happening, I think, is there's pressure to grow and to find ways to grow, and all that growth is in technology. And then two, which is another huge factor, regardless of even if that was the first part was true, is we're just the market's flush with capital right now. So companies have capital to spend, and the investors are telling them they need to spend it, which is wise. And so one way to do that is to go acquire businesses. And so we're just in an incredibly, I don't even know if lucrative is the right word to use. But there's a lot of activity done in this space, and which is driving that, and people are trying to diversify products and services. And so ultimately what that leads to is acquisitions of companies. And then now what is becoming much more salient for a salient point for us is how do you then deal with that from a technology perspective? So even if it isn't sort of investing in new technology and services, and it's just purely about buying other companies, well, there's a huge technology component that comes into integration between companies, and ultimately that comes down to operations. And ultimate operations, seems pretty obvious, but once the businesses are under one sort of roof, there's some serious synergies to be had by having everything controlled from one space. Not everybody does it that way, based on how they want to do it, but as a general rule of thumb is you can see some advantages there. So what we see a lot is, okay, we bought this company, in order to grow. And so growth no longer means growing by just selling more widgets. It's about acquiring the business. But now we have to go do this whole effort in order to get systems consolidated so that I can take advantage of partly why I would even buy this business for the crazy multiples that I'm paying today.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting time, I think, in general, not just for M&A, but if you just look back up and look at the corporate world in general and the level of disruption that's happening. And when I say disruption, that's not necessarily good or bad. It's just change, basically. But you look at what you're talking about, which is all this M&A activity happening, and that forces a certain amount of change on organizations. And then even for organizations that aren't going through M&A, you've got supply chain bottlenecks and disruptions. You have changing consumer demand. You mentioned retail and how now all of a sudden companies are sort of being forced into an e-commerce model that they weren't prepared for and their systems weren't built for, and they're kind of forcing that change is being forced upon them. So it's a really interesting time in the industry. I don't recall anything quite as turmoil based or disruptive as the time we're in right now, in my career, at least. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I mean, well, the funny one too is a lot of these trends were already happening, and then they all got accelerated last year. I think I forget if I don't know if I feel like you guys sent this or somebody sent this to me or I saw it. There was a little infographic and it had 2 bars and it said, "What change is driving my digital transformation?" And it was like 15% came from the CIO, and then 85% came from COVID.
Right.
And so it was,
that too.
and what was it? You know, it's obviously. It's sort of just a light touch joke about how what impact that's had, but I think it actually what really it speaks to is the reality of business, which is for the longest time, and I'm sure you probably have hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of content that talk about this. But you know, the word digital transformation has been used for the last 15 years. And all of a sudden, you know, in the last 18 months, it was like, if you're a CIO and you didn't do anything, I mean, you'd lose your job. Whereas actually you'd lose your job if you tried to go do a digital transformation project and it didn't work. And so that was the risk. And now the risk has turned over to, I simply can't not do something type of thing. So, you know, and I think, that to me is what has that's driving a lot of reaction, which was the trends were already there. It's not as if companies said, well, this whole remote working thing's not going to work. It was just, we don't know if we can succeed right now. And obviously the environment has now pushed that. And that's, you know, it's interesting. It's one of the things we talk about in software development is a lot of companies say they'll build something in software and say, well, it's done. Right? There's nothing more I need to do. And it's like, well, sure. Even if you feel like you're feature complete, software is a never ending story because the environment will eventually change at some point. The word entropy talks about the environment changing, and therefore whatever the substance that you're talking about starts to degrade because the environment degrades, not the actual substance itself. And that's so true in the IT environment, is that this environment is going to change. You know, today it's mobile phones. Well, maybe in 20 years, I'm somewhat bearish on VR, but let's say it's VR. We need to, you know, your system needs to be able to adapt to that changing environment.
Right. Yeah. Now you alluded to this. This next question I have for you. You alluded a little bit to earlier when you were talking about a sort of myopic view of IT and looking at hardware. I think that's one of the first things you mentioned is like the technologist in you said would typically kind of start off by looking at the hardware, but then obviously there's a lot more to it than just hardware when you think about how to scale an organization. But when you think about the ways that, or the things that are required to scale an organization for growth and the ways that IT needs to support that growth, what are some of the things that executives and CIOs are most likely to overlook, or that you most commonly see them not really thinking about when it comes to scaling?
The basics, honestly. I mean, it is shocking. I'm still surprised today just to see how many of the basics just get overlooked. And like, I'm talking about basic things like backups and recovery and to be fair, I think the reason that it's a challenge is because what is going back to the point before is that the environment has changed, right? So even if you had an ERP system that might have been installed, on premise, and that's fine. and you're backing that system up. Well, I don't know. There may have something changed, like that is now hosted in a data center. You might have moved to a colo or even in a cloud provider, and you just, as part of that process, never really thought about backups. And I know that sounds sort of basic to some of our audience, but at the same time, I'm always shocked to see how much that's overlooked, and then what that looks like then from and so this is where the challenge to scale becomes sort of a factor, is because oftentimes then we look almost myopically to say, hey, I want to be able to scale this system technically because I got to go add 500 users. And so then I just move to a cloud provider. And now all of a sudden the cloud provider, they've got a backup strategy that comes in that. And so and now it's a new territory. And I think that's often what happens, is trying to translate what we've learned in the 90s and the 80s, and from like mainframes, 3-tier architectures. We put all these processes, these procedures in place, and all of a sudden it's like, I shouldn't say it this way, but it's the reaction that when I see it is like, it's like you guys forgot about the basics. But I understand why it's happened. It's because the need to be able to scale those systems, because they put it into a different paradigm. And so therefore, trying to translate what you've traditionally done into those new environments is not easy. I mean, if you look at AWS's product catalog, I think it's I forget what the number is now. It's got to be something like 120 services. So if I was a CIO and somebody was saying, hey, which service to use, I mean, I'd have the biggest blank stare ever, right? And that was, if you looked at AWS maybe 8 years ago, it's probably like 10. So I can certainly appreciate that when you do want to take on some of these new paradigms, that the basics then start to change. So, a CIO in today's world might be having consultants come in and say, well, you should containerize everything and it'll solve everything. And it's like, what the heck is a container? And so, and now does a container need a backup, and like all these types of things, right? So I can certainly empathize with a lot of people in these positions, because yes, there is advantages to moving to some of these things, but oftentimes it has to be done in a way that understands what scale is required for that specific situation, right? Mm-hmm. So we talked about this before already, which is, does scale mean I need more users on it? Does scale mean I'm going to change my business? Does scale mean I'm going to invest into things that will help me change my business in the future? And I think that's where, I mean, we do, at the end of the day, we're working on IT strategy, and that's why IT strategy is so important. And it's so important to get right. And it starts with the business strategy. And so if the business strategy is done right, the IT strategy can be done right. And if it is done right, then the systems get done correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. And making sure that the IT strategy is indeed supporting and aligned with that business strategy. Do you ever find that to be a challenge, where at the corporate executive level, you've got sort of one vision and view of the world, and whether it's an M&A event or just growth in general, but then your IT strategy sort of supporting that is just out of sync, or they don't recognize the connection there?
The most common problem I see there is that the IT doesn't even, aren't brought to the table for the business strategy discussion, number one, or number two, they don't seek it out. And that's often, frankly, why we're asked to come in sometimes, is because there is that mismatch. And so we're able to come in and say, here's what you guys need to do from an IT strategy perspective. Oh, by the way, in order for us to help you do that, we don't even want to talk technology until we talk business first.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting for sure. And just making sure you've got that all in sync is key. And that we see that a lot too with our clients, is just making sure either you have IT at the table when you're talking about strategy, or at the very least, a second best but less desirable option is that just make sure that IT strategy gets aligned with the business strategy and the overall executive strategy. What about the people side of things? So when you think about just human behavior, organizational change, how does that factor into building stronger IT capabilities to help scale and fuel growth?
Yeah, I think so. There's two common things that I see. So from an executive standpoint, there are two types of, I would call it, personas that we see at the IT management level. There are people who are very good at vision and strategy, and there's people that are very good at execution. And so from the management layer, from an org perspective, being able to do both of those is incredibly sort of attractive from the rest of the sort of financial sponsor, board level type of people. So being able to do both of those is incredibly important. And that goes back to exactly the point I just made, which is those types of people are able to understand and be part of a business strategy discussion and then translate that. And then once they've done that, actually go execute it. So we've certainly seen companies where a CIO or CTO has very lofty goals, and then when they go to do pen to paper, it's sort of not there. So, and I think from a skill set standpoint, that's probably one of the biggest themes that we see. Day-to-day type of operations, we're starting to see, I think, a lot more, and I would say situations where IT is much more sort of back office related. I think a lot of the day-to-day IT activities are being outsourced to managed service providers, which to be honest is, I think, actually a pretty good strategy, just as a general, it has to fit the organization. The challenge that we then see is, because the point in doing all of that is standardizing processes. And so what that means then for changing organizations is, how do you move some of the sort of day-to-day activities over to a managed service provider, and then have the IT organization focus on things that are much more strategic, which I think as a general principle is sort of a good strategy. Obviously, some nuance depending on the situation. And so what ends up becoming actually more interesting then for a lot of management teams who are still doing day-to-day activities for the business is then understanding how to do partner management. And so oftentimes what we see is using a managed service provider just as a panacea to go solve IT issues. What ends up happening is that MSP might go and say, oh yeah, we do your security for you, or we ensure that everybody's on updated systems. And then you go and you see an audit and it's like, well, 10% of the organization is still on Windows XP. And you guys know that there's a security issue with that. Well, the MSP has no incentive to go and update that. So I think that's where some of the challenge that we've seen a lot is not even just like, hey, we need to go outsource this because it's cheaper, but just outsource this because it's less strategic. And then having the IT organization be focusing on those much more strategic initiatives. The problem is, and it goes back to what I said before, is that then they lose the basics, right? It's like, yeah, well, we had this MSP go and check this for us, and they're making sure that all of our systems are on the latest version of Windows. Well, sure. Well, what ended up happening was they just gave you the report that said that 10% of your organization's on XP, but nobody's actually executing on that. And so that's where partner management becomes a lot more important for those organizations. And so the skill sets are becoming around partner management, and then you're getting a big explosive growth in the whole MSP sort of space, which is, look, I just need to be able to do help desk type stuff. I don't want to manage it internally. I want to be more strategic about technology.
So is that desire to outsource certain parts of IT, is that pretty common or pretty widespread with the clients you work with?
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't. So outsource. First of all, I feel like outsource gets a bad rap, right?
Yeah.
And so I think 25 years ago, let's say, it was like everything was outsourcing, right? Let's go build the largest team possible in China or India or wherever as quickly as possible and do it for as cheap as possible, because IT is not a strategic function. And if we remember those conversations, right? It's really interesting to think about them now, because it's almost done a complete flip, which is, it's like, well, technology now has to be strategic. And I think this is, to me, is probably the biggest challenges for most organizations, is being able to discern between what parts of IT functions are strategic and which is sort of day-to-day business as usual, keep the lights on type of thing. And so to me, that's where it becomes incredibly important.
Yeah. And certainly if you're using cloud technologies or other types of things that lend themselves, that sort of by definition is going to be more of a call it an outsourced model, even though that may not be the intent, you're inherently shifting some of that maintenance and break fix type stuff over to an outside vendor or an MSP in that way. So
yeah, well, and it's exactly the point we talked about before. Like, I mean, there's almost a PhD required just to understand what every AWS service does, right? And so it's like asking somebody to go and say, hey, we're going to go migrate my whole data center over to Amazon Web Services. And just to do a lift and shift, actually economically, that usually doesn't make any sense to go do that. But we see a lot of companies do it. It then becomes, well, how do I take advantage of this new web service that AWS just came out with? And just being able to navigate that alone requires almost like a full-time resource. So I think that's where it starts to change a little bit, and the expertise is changing. But this is no different, 20, 30 years ago when somebody said, I need to go stand up a data center somewhere. And you're like, I don't know what a data center is, but I know that I don't want to have this server in my office anymore.
Yeah. It's interesting the way you frame a lot of this in the context of how a lot of this isn't new. It's just a lot of this is being accelerated. I think is one of the comments you made that, a lot of the stuff was brewing or percolating under the surface or was starting to pick up momentum, and then COVID hits and, suddenly a bunch of M&A activity happens. A lot of stuff is sort of speeding this up or adding fuel to the fire in a lot of ways.
Yep.
Now, what about cybersecurity? How are you seeing cybersecurity fit into just scaling IT organizations? And especially recently, it seems like that's another area that's really picking up steam and picking up a sense of urgency, is making sure you lock down your systems when you have, US pipelines being hacked and supply chain related organizations being hacked, and a lot of that stuff happening throughout the world. How is that factoring into scaling an IT organization?
If anything, it's slowing it. And so what's interesting is there's actually a really good sort of conversation about this, which is security is at the antithesis of accessibility. And so what that means in practice is that when you look at organizations who are trying to go and digitally transform or trying to scale their systems, what is increasingly becoming an issue is then how to secure those systems. So, and going back to that sort of accessibility versus security, what ends up happening is the more accessible you make a system, inherently the less secure it is. So, and to put this even sort of more plainly, I've seen environments, for example, Fortune 500 companies who say, they're like, look, we have this super secure financial information that only 10 people in the organization can view. Well, but we want to be hosted on the cloud, but yet that's sort of like against this idea. Like, and traditionally it was like literally they had the computer in a room, and the only way you could access the computer, it wasn't connected to the internet, was to be in that room. And so now that's obviously a challenge to scale, which is, the idea of having somebody to physically have to go into a computer room to access system is I mean, it's almost childish when we say it today, right? But there's an actual, there might be an actual business reason for that that capability, and so now we're saying, well, we want all the advantages of cloud and being able to just spin a server up and be able to jump into that and get the data, when I'm sitting on a beach in Mexico. But I also want to have all the security of lockdown that I had before. And so in some ways, every sort of like 2 steps that you take forward on progression of digital transformation, you almost inherently take a step backwards to go and ensure that it's secure. And I think, some just like really simple, obvious things that we've seen, and probably the most classic one I've seen in the last couple of years is people who, they migrate to AWS and they leave their AWS has a service called S3, which just stores sort of physical files. And one of the most common issues with that is people just leave them open so that somebody can just go scan AWS and say, hey, I don't know, Home Depot has a bunch of files sitting there and they're not locked down. and it was used for an internal system that the system itself was locked down, but then the service that stores the media wasn't. And so somebody could just pull the sensitive information down. And like, this was like this. So this is just a great example because S3 has like this, it's got petabytes of information in it. So even at a single client, they may even have up to terabytes of information stored on there. So all of a sudden we have this great service that like scales almost like infinitely. Now has like this just inherent like issue with it, which is like, it's sort of just open if you don't lock it down. So it's like, yes, on one hand, we have this new tool that gives us the scalability, but likewise, it just gave us this massive hole in our security capabilities. And so this is all going back to the point that I initially made, which is like security is the thing that tells you can't scale anymore, because it's just it doesn't want you to scale, because the easier it is to scale, the more prone and the more attack vectors you're opening yourself up to.
That's super interesting. I never connected those dots before, and it's also it's also potentially connecting the dots of just flexibility. You talk about scale and how to be secure, you're inherently creating sort of a tension between scale and security. But it's the same with flexibility, I would assume, where if you want flexibility, whether you're growing or not, although chances are you're probably growing if you want that flexibility, it's going to be harder to have that sort of flexibility within your operations, your infrastructure. At the same time, you're tightening down security. Would that apply there as well?
Yeah. And that's a little, I mean, in some ways, what I'm referring to is flexibility is synonymous with that scalability, right? So the ability to go and adapt your environment into the new environment of the world, and having that flexibility and agility to do so. Yeah. Every step that you want to take towards doing that is having to keeping in mind of what security means.
Interesting. Huh.
A great example, if I don't know if you're aware, I mean, so Google, I think it was, I want to say almost 5 years ago now. So like the traditional way of locking down a system and a corporate system was that it would just sat behind the firewall, right? So, and the traditional view of security, or corporate security corporate IT security was, as long as it sits within the firewall, like nothing can get in, right? Or nothing can touch a system. And so Google, I think about 5 years ago, said, look, in order for our client or our employees to be able to work, like we don't really have a shield that sits around our corporate function anymore. So there's no actually, like, you don't firewall in if you're an employee at Google. They rely on two-factor authentication for their systems, and so you're just authenticated against your identity. Obviously, there's a little bit more advanced components to that, but the point is you're not VPNing into the corporate LAN to then be able to access systems anymore. Now they might use VPN to whitelist themselves into certain systems, but the point is that that sort of traditionalist view is being changed, and now actually that is where some of the flexibility is. But the complexity of that is incredible, and only a company like Google at this point has been able to do that. Well, I shouldn't say the only. They're an organization that can do that because of how they're set up.
Interesting. Huh. Very, very cool. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk, maybe hone in on this M&A concept a bit more, even though a lot of what we've been talking about has involved M&A, or that's part of where the angle we've come at it from. But the question I had for you is, what are some of the biggest challenges that we haven't already talked about when you're integrating IT as part of a merger and acquisition integration? So in other words, company A goes out and acquires company B. You've got two IT departments now. You've got to figure out how to put those two IT departments and capabilities together. What are some of the biggest challenges you see in trying to do that with some of these M&A situations?
So a couple of things. Just as a general one, I kind of alluded to this a little bit. Technical debt and legacy technologies that are unsupported are very commonplace. We see that a lot. And so what ends up happening is let's say that there is a merger or an acquisition from a portfolio company or just, a corporate company that wants to acquire. If their systems, the parent company itself, are not sort of up to par, and then they go and acquire and they're trying to consume something into theirs, so that's usually a challenge. Then the other challenge then is they go look at the acquisition and they say, okay, look, these guys have a certain system. How do we then bring them under our wing and under our kind of platform? You mentioned about skill sets. So skill sets are always a challenge, and understanding how you might be able to do that. I think what's been very interesting in my experience is that, like, somebody who might have been working as a CIO or IT manager, VP IT, whatever the title is, they may be very exceptional and very good at what they do in terms of that sort of strategy and execution. But when they then have to go and acquire another business and they've never actually been in that situation, it can be incredibly daunting. And not for a lack of trying or skill set or whatever, but simply just because they haven't done it before. And frankly, that's why consultants exist. And I as a consultant myself, I'm actually very anti-consultant. But this is actually one of these situations where there's just so few people who actually have been in the trenches of an acquisition and then kind of gone through what the complications are, that expertise is incredibly valuable. Because there's so much nuance that you have to like appreciate, and at the end of the day, what ends up happening is you're really just dealing with like two organizations that are almost foreign to each other that then have to sort of come together and marry themselves up. And so if you're really good at being like, hey, I can stand up an ERP system and I know how to talk to the business and blah, blah, blah. But if you don't know how to like bring another organization into yours and do that in a delicate way, but also a meaningful way, I mean, that's not an easy task to do. So I think like those are some of the biggest challenges. Security is like, I mean, by far the hardest one, I would say, the most difficult. Everybody gets it wrong, and I don't blame them. I think it's because you might have your corporate security set up in one way. You go and acquire another business, and you realize their security is very lackluster, and now you have to bring them under yours. And you've just spent all these years and months trying to train your people how to do the right thing, and now you have this least common denominator that might be smaller, but that part gets attacked, and it might have implications on you as an overall entity. So you now all of a sudden have to get that company up to speed. So there's just the complexities of it are not short. And I think at the end of the day, as human beings, especially in IT, we always like to be more ambitious than we think, or more confident about our capabilities. And I think it's a very difficult thing to do, and getting beyond that sort of idea that, hey, this is easy. We can just take their system and pull it into ours. I mean, it always takes 1.5 to 2 times as long and costs 1.5 to 2 times as much.
Yeah. And I've read plenty of studies. I'm sure you've seen the same ones about M&A integration success rates, or failure rates more specifically, and how, 80% or so fail in the integration efforts. And the same is true for digital transformations, by the way. But any sort of massive change like that, companies just don't have a good track record with.
Yeah. Well, and my favorite thing to pose to everybody when those statistics come up is, what's your definition of a success or a failure? Because nobody ever really likes to talk about that.
Right.
And to me, actually, that is part of the reason why they, statistically, let's say, get succeed or fail, is because the definition of success never was established at the beginning. A successful, for example, outcome for an acquisition might be that you're going to decommission the whole thing, because it doesn't make sense to continue to operate on a system that is not fit for purpose, or has technical debt or whatever. And so success might actually look like something very different. Whereas if somebody wanted to go, let's say they integrated the system completely, it worked perfectly, but the business all of a sudden couldn't ship half their products, let's say. Sure, it's successfully integrated, and the company now is running on that system, but the business, let's say, took a 5% revenue hit, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's not success to me. So I think that's, to me, actually the biggest thing that is helpful going into those is, and this goes back to IT strategy, which all starts with what's the business strategy, and M&A is no different. You have to understand why you're actually acquiring the business and what it's going to mean for the business, and then IT can follow that story and support it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's brilliant comment, and I totally agree on the definition of success versus failure. I think that's where a lot of companies get tripped up, and they focus so much on let's implement on time, on budget, and that's going to define success for us versus, well, what was your overall value? What was your overall ROI? And I think if a lot of organizations were honest with themselves, I think a lot of companies that said they were successful or think they were successful in their transformations would actually find that they weren't successful because they left so much value on the table, or they disrupted the business more than they needed to, failed to realize the opportunities or the upside in a way they should have. It's a good point. What about data? Is data? I would imagine, and this is just based on, we work with a lot of clients. A lot of them, a fair amount of them, are involved in some sort of M&A integration, or in the past they've been through an M&A integration, but a lot of them haven't been through that. But of the ones that we've worked with that have gone through that sort of integration, data is a pretty big deal as far as just sort of cleaning it all up and reconciling master data and having a unified way of speaking, for lack of a better word. Is that a big thing that you guys look at, or a challenge that you see in these sorts of integrations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, at the end of the day, like, one of the things, I'll give you a great example. Like, we had a client that did a big software roll up, and it was interesting because they were like, oh, we're going to buy all these companies in this one space, and they're sort of industry specific ERP systems. And we're like, well, why do you want to do that? And they said, well, we're able to sort of realize some synergies by doing that, and we can cross sell. It was one of the big points. And so my sort of immediate reaction was, well, in order for that sales team to be able to cross sell, they have to know who the other customers are and if there's any crossover of customers. And it took them like 2 years to just even realize that, like, there was let's say they had 10 companies. Across the 10 companies, they shared 15% of them all had common customers. Well, the reason that they were so challenged to be able to figure that out was because they didn't really actually have a definition of who their customer was. And I know that sounds silly, but actually this is much more common than you think. And so when we then think about data and why data is so important, is because in order to realize some of those objectives, in order to do a cross-sell opportunity, so if, let's say my client is, I'm going to pick up Walmart, right? And I've now have 6 companies that have software, or that provide software, and I find out 3 of them are selling to Walmart. Well, that fourth one, if I didn't know that, and I could have cross-sold it, and the sooner I was able to realize that, the sooner I'm able to actually realize the value of the acquisition. And so one of the common terms that actually is starting to be termed, I would say, in private equity and sort of advisory around private equity, is this phrase called delivering deal value. And it seems really silly that consultants actually have to go out and tell people that are making acquisitions how to gain the value of the deal. But there's sort of two issues with it. Sometimes the value of the deal doesn't really get understood at the beginning, which is one part of just digging in and being like, hey, there's a serious opportunity. By the way, the company you're buying is sitting on this treasure trove of data. And then 2 is actual execution of that and saying, okay, how do we actually take that data and harmonize it into our own? Well, I can tell you, like, 9 times out of 10, the company that's doing the acquisition probably doesn't even have their data in a good enough format and situation, and can't even define its own way of what revenue is or sales is. And again, it sort of goes back to a lot of basics. It's unbelievable what advantages you can have by saying, like, hey, look, I know what a customer is for us. I know what a sale is for us. And so when we go to look to acquire, I want to go and take those same metrics, and we're going to actually impose our definitions with some thoughtful exercises, but impose our definitions so that when we do say, hey, how do we cross-sell? I have the data there, and then I can report on it, and then I can make a decision to be able to actually realize some of that deal value essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds so basic, but in some ways it's not. And it has such high value though, too. I mean, if you can get that part right in that situation, that has a huge amount of value.
Yep.
Yeah. So a couple more questions just in the time we have with you here. What about when it comes to just trends in the market? This is probably a good sort of a capstone question for you. When you look at all the different trends in the market, and we've covered a lot of them here. We've talked about a little bit about cloud. We've talked about obviously M&A activity picking up. That's sort of a general trend that's happening more and more. I know I alluded to supply chain related issues. That's another trend that may not be a good one, but it's a change in the industry as far as supply chain struggling right now to keep up with demand. You have changing consumer behavior and changing demand for different types of products that's changing. Well, you just look at overall trends across the board, as it relates to IT capabilities and supporting growth of organizations. What are some of the trends that aren't the coolest necessarily, but are the ones that are most relevant, you think, to high growth organizations that you work with?
So what's interesting is, business process automation has been talked about forever. Mm-hmm. I think the modern version of business process automation is I believe the name is now escaping me, but I think it's RPA. That's a robotic process automation, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And what's really interesting about it, and I understand why it's trendy, and can appreciate why organizations want to make those investments. And ultimately what it comes down to is that for a lot of organizations, there are repeatable tasks that happen day to day. And I think what is happening is we're starting to get a little bit more intelligent with actual software as opposed to just implementing software about how to take those repetitive processes and then either enable them or just purely automate them away. And so like a lot of the RPA tools and stuff are quite interesting from that perspective, is not only the actual ability to do some of it technically is super interesting, but I think what's even more interesting is being able to identify and understand what does a business process look like, and then how do I actually sort of automate that to the point where it's like I shouldn't have to do the same thing, the same identical thing over and over again. And I think that is an area that we're starting to see is like it's been talked about for a long time. It is a little bit shiny, but I also think like people are ignoring just like the basic things of like, I've seen a lot of distribution and manufacturing companies who they get orders through an Excel file that gets sent over and an email. And so being able to like, and nobody likes to talk about this stuff because it's like actually a little bit difficult because that's still the way a lot of businesses operate. And so being able to sort of take that capability and then automate it, but still do it in a way that sort of like keeps that manual step there almost in a sense, because it's like, well, this part of the market still is doing this thing. And so we just need to like have the technology adapt to it. It's like less sexy, but it's actually like drives incredible amount of value, right? Yeah. Like I've actually thought about for the longest time, just like building a simple tool that just takes an email inbox and then just scrapes the Excel file that comes in for order management, and then just building an API out of it so that it can be sent to an ERP system. Because like I just see that all the time, right? And so it's just like stuff like that where it seems so simple, but it's actually simple because the process is simple, but nobody really wants to go and automate it away because the market's all saying like, hey, you need to be like Google and, have like everything done by AI. And it's like, well, AI is not going to solve that. Like this is something that is repetitive that you can just, put a simple process in for.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people forget that there's oftentimes lower hanging fruit than going through an entire, and I know that technically is part of a digital transformation, what you just described. If you were to go in and create that app or build a application that could scrape those incoming emails, create a customer order or sales order, that is technically, I guess, somewhat of a digital transformation. But I think a lot of times companies get so enamored by, well, let's go, switch everything in our organization over to the cloud. We're going to go with a single ERP system, and they don't say this or think this, but they throw the baby out with the bathwater. They're going to try and rip everything out and replace it all. Whereas, sometimes we'll come in and say, well, do you really need to replace your system? Your vendors may be telling you should, because they want you to upgrade to their newest cloud solution or whatever. But what if you spend less money and got more value out of something like that? I think a lot of organizations forget that, sort of the easier answer, I should say.
Yeah. And I think, look, as I said, I can empathize a lot with CIOs, because in fact, I've a couple of the ones that I'm pretty close with, they're bombarded with emails from people selling them all these shiny new tools. And I have to kind of pause have the conversation with them to say, look, pause. It doesn't matter what this shiny new tool can do. It's what is the business problems that you guys have that you can actually put tools in for. Trying to go and launch an e-commerce site for a distributor is a daunting task. It's not easy. But finding areas, as you said, like quick wins, actually can be somewhat easy. And what it can do then is provide a learning process for you to then enable other systems and processes that you didn't think were capable there. And then, by the way, if you want to go and launch the e-commerce project, it becomes that much easier, because now you have a business and an IT organization that's enabled to actually successfully implement those projects. One, identify them, and then two, actually implement them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah, it builds that momentum. Not only do you get the immediate value of something like that, but it builds that momentum to where you could then start to get a little more confident, get your legs underneath you, and go start to tackle bigger or more complex issues than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, this has been a great discussion, Mike. Really appreciate you joining us on this live stream and the discussion here today. And this is really good stuff. And like I said, I think so much of what you've talked about, even the examples you gave related to M&A integration and more M&A specific activities or issues, I think so much of that can be applicable or should be lessons for small, mid-sized, high-growth organizations that maybe aren't even thinking about M&A right now, but it could still, a lot of those principles apply across the board. So I really appreciate some of the insights you shared here today.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks to our audience for being here as well. Hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to chatting with you soon.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks.